Welcome to the lecture on civil rights and Black Power. We're going to start today by introducing you to a different narrative of the civil rights movement, which historians call the long civil rights movement. And so the goal of the long civil rights movement is to get away from the popular, watered-down history of the civil rights movement that's become popular since the 1980s. And that popular story is one that confines the movement to the period between 1954 and 1965. It confines the movement to the South. It confines the movement to a few issues, segregation and voting rights. And it confines the movement to a weird brand of nonviolent protest that actually ignores just how disruptive nonviolent protest actually was. And so this history is not only historically inaccurate, but it's used to attack contemporary movements for racial justice. I'm sure if any of you pay attention to any contemporary protest, you've heard some form of the, why can't they protest like Martin Luther King, or why have protesters strayed so far from the civil rights movement argument. And so that's why history is so important. It's consistently used as a political tool. And so historians have turned to the long civil rights movement story to try to refute some of the myths that are used to attack contemporary social movements. And so by looking at the long civil rights movement, we're trying to rethink a few things. We can rethink famous civil rights activists. We can rethink where the movement unfolded, not just in the South, but a national movement. We can rethink when the movement unfolded, not just between 1954 to 1965, but we can move the movement way back, at least into the 1930s. And we can rethink the key issues of the movement, that the civil rights movement was more than just about trying to challenge segregation and a lack of voting rights. And so let's try to get into some of these things and how we rethought the civil rights movement. And so historians have become very concerned about how people have used certain famous civil rights activists to attack contemporary movements. Rosa Parks, for example, suddenly becomes a passive seamstress who just decided one day not to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. But Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist who worked for the NAACP when she used nonviolent civil disobedience to challenge segregation laws. And not only that, she didn't simply focus on segregation. And so I want to read an excerpt from a great book by Danielle McGuire called At the Dark End of the Street, to give you a sense of what Rosa Parks was fighting for before she decided to challenge segregation laws on that bus in Montgomery. So here's this short excerpt from a great book by Danielle McGuire. And it goes like this. On September 3rd, 1944, the Rock Hill Holiness Church in Abbeville, Alabama, rocked late into the night. It was early midnight when the doors of the wooden one-story church swung open, releasing streams of worshipers, all African American, into the moonlight. After a night of singing and praying, Reese Taylor, Fanny Daniel, and Daniel's 18-year-old son, West, stepped out of the country chapel and strolled toward home alongside the peanut plantations that bounded the Abbeville Headland Highway. Taylor, a slender, copper-colored woman and beautiful 24-year-old mother and sharecropper, noticed a rattletrap green Chevrolet pass them at least 3 times, young white men gawking from its windows. "You reckon what they're up to?" Taylor asked. Taylor and Daniel, a stout 61-year-old woman, watched the car creep by one last time and roll to a stop a few feet ahead of them. 7 men armed with knives and guns got out of the car and walked toward the women. Herbert Lovett, the oldest of the crew at 24 and a private in the U.S. Army, shouted, "Halt." When they ignored the order, Lovett leveled his gun. West tugged at his mother's sleeve, begged her to stop. "They might shoot you," he whispered. As the circle of men closed in, Lovett waved his gun at Taylor. "We're looking for this girl right here. She's the one who cut that white boy and clocked him this evening," Lovett said, adding that the local sheriff, George H. Gamble, had dispatched the group to find the alleged assailant. "You're wrong," Fanny insisted. She's been at my house all day." The men crowded closer, nodding their heads in agreement. "Ain't this her?" Lovett asked. "Yep, this is the one," Joe Culpepper said. "I know by the clothes she got on." "That's her," Luther Lee agreed. "Get her." Lovett lurched towards Taylor and grabbed her arm. Then he turned to West and asked if Taylor was his wife. No, West replied. She's Willie Guy, Taylor's wife. Undeterred, Lovett extended his hand to the teenager, ordered him to shake it, and promised not to hurt Taylor. We're going to take her up here to see if Mr. Gamble knows her, Lovett claimed. If she's not the one, we'll bring her right back. As Lovett spoke, Taylor managed to wrest her arm from his grasp and bolted toward a stand of trees behind the cabin. Come back, Fanny yelled. They're going to shoot you. Come back. Stop, Lovett shouted. He cocked the gun at the back of her head. I'll kill you if you run. Lovett walked Taylor to the car and shoved her into the back seat. 3 men piled in behind her while 4 others squeezed into the front. The headlights switched off and the car crept away. After a few miles, the green sedan turned off the main highway, rattled down a red clay tractor path into the woods, and stopped in a grove of pecan trees. Y'all ain't carrying me to Mr. Gamble, Taylor shouted. The men in the back seat clasped her wrist and ordered her to be quiet. Lovett grabbed his gun and waved Taylor and his companions out of the car. Get them rags off, he barked, pointing the shotgun at her, or I'll kill you and leave you down here in the woods. Sobbing, Taylor pulled off her clothes. Please, she cried, let me go home to my husband and my baby. Lovett spread an old hunting coat on the ground, told his friends to strip down to their socks and undershirts, and ordered Taylor to lie down. Lovett passed his rifle to a friend and took off his pants. Hovering over the young mother, he snarled, act just like you do with your husband, or I'll cut your damn throat. Lovett was the first of 6 men to rape Taylor that night. When they finished, someone helped her get dressed, tied a handkerchief over her eyes, and shoved her into the back of the car. Back on the highway, the men stopped and ordered Taylor out of the car. Don't move until we get away from here, one of them yelled. Taylor heard the car disappear into the night. She pulled off the blindfold, got her bearings, and began the long walk home. A few days later, a telephone rang at the NAACP branch office in Montgomery, Alabama. E.D. Nixon, the local president, promised to send his best investigator to Abbeville. That investigator would launch a movement that ultimately changed the world. Her name was Rosa Parks. And so this story does a couple of things. Number one, shows us that Rosa Parks was a long-term activist, one who has cut her teeth in activism long before she decided not to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. But two, it shows us just how broad the civil rights movement was in terms of what civil rights movement activists were concerned about and what they were fighting against. Right? One of the issues that we never talk about when we talk about the civil rights movement is the issue of rape. And rape was really central to the civil rights movement. You know, white men basically owned black women's bodies in the South in the way that Jim Crow was set up. And this is something that Rosa Parks was fighting against, to try to hold white men accountable for raping black women in the South. If we look at another, famous activist, Martin Luther King has become really the ultimate symbol of how people have watered down the civil rights movement. There are few people whose history has been more mangled than King. An activist visited Martin Luther King in his home in 1956 and reported that the place is an arsenal, and King often had armed guards around him. And this was, no different than a lot of civil rights activists. Daisy Bates, who was one of the important activists involved in the famous school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas, wrote to Thurgood Marshall in 1959 to tell him that she kept Old Betsy well oiled and the guards were always on alert. She also bragged about, carrying a .32 caliber pistol around with her. But that's only a small part of how we misremember King. King came out against the Vietnam War and called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. In Birmingham, the famous protest that you all know because you've seen the pictures of fire hoses and vicious dogs used on protesters. That simply wasn't about ending segregation. King and other organizers in Birmingham fought for jobs for African Americans in downtown department stores. Workplace justice was also a key part of the 1963 March on Washington, where King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And what we often don't remember is that the march's full name is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We leave out that last part when we think about the March on Washington. And in 1968, when he was killed in Memphis by a white supremacist, he was there to help black sanitation workers collectively bargain. Right? And so there's this broader agenda that Martin Luther King had than the watered down one that we have remembered in recent decades and that you've probably been taught in high school. And finally, I want to bring out King's vision of nonviolence. And this too has been watered down to attack nonviolent protests in the present. And there's this weird idea now that civil rights activists' nonviolence tactics just never disrupted anyone's lives or never made anyone feel uncomfortable. But that's the entire point of nonviolent civil disobedience. And so I want to bring that out in the primary document I had you read for today, which is King's famous letter from the Birmingham jail in 1963. And so this is on page 2 of the PDF, starts on page 2 of the PDF document, and he writes, "You may well ask, why direct action, why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? You are exactly right in your call for negotiations. Indeed, this is the purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such a creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. I just refer to the creation of tension as a part of the work of the nonviolent resistor. This may sound rather shocking, but I must confess that I'm not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth. Just as Socrates felt that it was necessary to create a tension in the mind so that individuals could rise from the bondage of myths and half-truths to the unfettered realm of creative analysis and objective appraisal, we must see the need of having nonviolent gadflies to create the kind of tension in society that will help men to rise from the dark depths of prejudice and racism to the majestic heights of understanding and brotherhood. So the purpose of direct action is to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation," end quote. So here he's saying that this sort of tension and crisis, he uses the word crisis here, right? That civil disobedience is supposed to create a crisis that disrupts the other people's worlds so they can start to question their dominant views. And so he also addresses the common criticism that a protest is untimely. You probably heard that, recently with protests, that it's just not the right time. And so here he writes, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a in a direct action movement that was well-timed according to the timetable of those who have not suffered." And then in maybe the most famous passage of the letter, he addresses what he calls the white moderate. And that means just those people who agree with the goals of activists, but attack their methods. And so here King writes, "I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action.'" And so the point here is that, the person who we now hold up and celebrate was hated in his own time as an agitator, a radical, a troublemaker. And history teaches us that no person fighting for dramatic social change in a democracy is widely loved by the majority of the country. right? It's only long after the fact, long after these activists were put in prison, long after they were called radicals, long after they were beaten or even killed, does the majority look back and celebrate them. Another important change that the long civil rights movement story has brought us is that historians have tried to challenge the 1954 to 1965 time frame. That's the kind of traditional way to view the civil rights movement. That time frame is really an attempt to limit what the civil rights movement was about. But the civil rights movement didn't begin in 1954. It stretches back at least as far back as the 1930s. And so when we look at the movement starting at least as far back in the 1930s, a new story emerges that it forces us outside the South and gets us to see the problems African Americans faced differently. And so when we go back into the 1930s, it forces us to bring back a term that we first talked about in the Reconstruction lecture, which is racial capitalism, right? In the North and the South, African Americans confronted a discriminatory system set up to exploit and maintain a cheap black labor pool. And so one of the primary purposes of the civil rights movement, one that we completely ignore usually, is the purpose to challenge racial capitalism. And so when we bring that story into our view, we have to see African Americans fight to get access to unions, for example, which usually excluded black workers, as an important part of the civil rights movement. We have to see African Americans' efforts to create their own unions as an important part. So someone like A. Philip Randolph here has to become an important figure in this story. He was someone since 1925, he was the leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which represented about 12,000 black porters who worked in Pullman trains. And along the way, he fought white unions for recognition and Pullman bosses for better conditions. In May 1941, he threatened Franklin Roosevelt with a march on Washington with over 100,000 black workers unless the president outlawed discrimination in defense employment and in the Army. And so finally, FDR signed Executive Order 8802, which required non-discrimination in defense employment and established the Fair Employment Practices Committee. And he's also someone who eventually helped organize the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Another tactic that we generally ignore is a really popular tactic that started in the 1930s, which is don't buy where you can't work. What African Americans did was that they targeted businesses. This generally often happened in the North. They targeted businesses who refused to hire black workers, and they boycotted those businesses. So don't buy where you can't work is a reference to boycott here. And they demanded that those businesses hire a certain number of black workers immediately. And we go back to the 1930s, we also have to bring in someone like Lovett Fort Whiteman, who we talked about in a previous lecture, right? And have to recognize that the role of communism was important for a lot of African American activists because before the post-World War II period, the Communist Party is really the only party in the United States who made racial equality an important part of their platform. When we bring all these things together, we also have to see the 1950s a bit differently, right? In the traditional narrative, the 1950s is the start of the movement. But really, the 1950s is the low point of the civil rights movement, right? It's the low point because the Cold War forced these civil rights activists who had been working for decades, often with some ties to the Communist Party. They forced these organizations to purge all of those members. It also forced them to often stop talking about issues that could be easily tied to communism or critiqued in that way. And we also have to see the FBI as an important part of trying to undermine the civil rights movement. That's also something that historians are trying to bring into that long civil rights movement story. Just to give you one quick story, the FBI was recording Martin Luther King. And at one point, they had a recording of him having an affair with another woman. And so they wrote a letter to King and said that he had two choices. One was to kill himself, or two, they would send the recording to King's wife, right? And so I bring this up in part because we're about to watch Mississippi Burning. And in Mississippi Burning, the FBI kind of plays the role of heroes. And that's why one of the reasons why the movie is kind of difficult to watch for historians, because the FBI suddenly turned themselves into heroes in the movie when the FBI had consistently been fighting against the civil rights movement. Okay, and so moving back to economic justice and bringing that into the picture. When we do that, it gets us to rethink the rise of affirmative action and the effectiveness of colorblindness. The problem was that for all of these victories that supposedly outlaw discrimination, we look at the 1940s and 1950s, the civil rights movement wins lots of anti-discrimination laws, especially in northern states. The problem was that little actually changed in those northern states from these laws that supposedly said you could not discriminate. So there was a huge gap between political victories and results. And so what African Americans found was that it was really easy to appear to be colorblind and still discriminate, right? So if we look at Philadelphia to see how this worked and how the civil rights movement changed their tactics. In 1948, Philadelphia City Council enacted a Fair Employment Practices Ordinance which outlawed discrimination. And yet, African Americans still had the lowest paying jobs and they suffered high unemployment rates. And if we look at unions, what we see is that despite these laws, African Americans were still relegated to the most menial, unskilled positions. Access to good union jobs, were especially important in industrial cities because unions were usually the best shot for the working class to gain some sort of economic security and access to middle class lifestyles, which included the ability to own your own house. And the problem was that these union jobs were largely the privilege of the white working class. Right. And so how did businesses and unions confine African Americans to the most menial jobs despite these fair employment laws on the books? Well, they developed what appeared on the surface to be colorblind practices, but in reality produced race-conscious results. Right. So knowing that African Americans were in substandard schools, businesses understood that they could develop employment tests that had nothing to do with the tasks involved in the job, but would fail most African American applicants, right? These tests wouldn't be struck down by the Supreme Court until the 1970s, and we still have lots of latitude for these tests that still exist. Unions too developed their own practices, right? Knowing that unions had for a long time been allowed under the law to consciously prohibit African Americans from membership, they came up with a practice of giving preferences to family members of union members. And so that policy says nothing about race. But because before these anti-discrimination laws went into effect, only whites had been allowed into the union, giving preference to the family of union members effectively gave unions the ability to bar African Americans from the coveted union jobs. And so how did African American activists respond to the failure of anti-discrimination laws to produce equal opportunity? Well, by the early 1960s, civil rights activists began calling for affirmative action. And so in 1960, Leon Sullivan, who's pictured here, a minister in Philadelphia, formed an organization called the Committee of 400 to lead a boycott campaign against companies that continue to use discriminatory hiring practices. And these boycotts often referred to don't buy where you can't work, right? What we just discussed. And so Sullivan began with Tastykakes because their products were especially popular in African American communities. And after a long boycott hurt the profits, Tastykakes finally agreed to negotiate. And Sullivan didn't want more non-discrimination agreements. Companies had been agreeing to not discriminate in Philadelphia since World War II, but then would continue to find ways to comply with non-discrimination laws while still effectively excluding African Americans. So Sullivan demanded the company hire a specific number of African Americans in certain positions immediately. And after Tastykake, Sullivan then went on to lead similar campaigns against other major companies in Philadelphia, including Pepsi, calling for a specific number of Black employees. And we see protests like this and tactics like this going on all across the country. To deal with union discrimination on construction sites, another organization, CORE, the same organization that led the freedom rides throughout the South, demanded that 15% of Philadelphia construction jobs funded by the government go directly to Black workers. And so demands like these became popular throughout the northern cities in the early 1960s. But it wasn't just the North. Remember that I referenced Birmingham earlier. A part of their demands was the ability to shop in downtown stores, but also they wanted each department store to hire 3 Black workers immediately, right? So it's important to understand that affirmative action doesn't come out of Black power, right? It wasn't created by a bunch of federal bureaucrats. The origins of affirmative action come out of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s that are reacting to the failure of these colorblind laws to change their economic opportunities. All right, so another thing that we get to when we push the story back, we also start to see just how much violence and resistance there was to the civil rights movement outside the South. If you really go back to the, Great Migration starting in World War I, we see this really harsh resistance to Black migration in northern cities. And we see, between 1917 and 1921, some 58 homemade bombs were thrown at homes of Black migrants who spilled into white areas of Chicago. Between May and October 1919, at least 25 anti-Black riots broke out across the country. During the famous Chicago race riot, Haywood Hall, and this is kind of part of the story about how African Americans have reacted to that violence with self-defense. In the Chicago race riot, Haywood Hall and Army friends set up a machine gun by an upstairs window in Washington, D.C. And then in Washington, D.C., some 300 African Americans were wounded on the first night of violence. The following night, more whites than Blacks were wounded. So, tons of violence coming out of Black migration into northern cities. We also had in the North things called sundown towns, which basically refer to any organized jurisdiction that kept African Americans or other groups from living in it, and was thus all white on purpose, right, out of design. And thousands of these towns start popping up in 1890, and a lot of these continue until 1968. Many towns drove out their Black populations, then posted sundown signs. Other towns passed ordinances barring African Americans after dark and prohibited African Americans from owning or renting property. And some of these examples include Ferguson, Missouri, Appleton, Wisconsin, Livonia, Michigan, Parma, Ohio. Illinois alone had 475 sundown towns. Half of the towns in Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio were sundown towns. Another story about kind of violent resistance to African American presence in areas that whites wanted to kind of preserve as all white is the story of the Trumbull Park homes, which are pictured here. And so in August 1953, Donald and Betty Howard moved into Trumbull Park Homes in Chicago, which was an all-white public housing unit run by the city. And the city had a non-discrimination housing ordinance on the books, and the Chicago Public Housing Ordinance Housing Office's application did not actually include questions about race. And so the question is, so how did public housing maintain segregation? Well, they had interviews with applicants, and just by seeing them, they could ascertain their race and segregated the housing units that way. But because Donald Howard was a veteran, he didn't have to go through that sort of application process. And so they didn't see their racial identity. And so they move in. And white residents, didn't initially notice that African Americans had moved into the housing unit. because Betty Howard was, fair skin. But when residents finally saw Donald Howard, who had darker skin, they began assembling a mob outside of their apartment. They firebombed their apartment and assaulted them in the community. Donald Howard had to start carrying a gun for self-defense and flashed it at white residents when he was in danger in the community. And so we have all of these stories, and it's especially true when neighborhoods begin to be integrated. The first black family moves into a neighborhood. What often happens is mobs assemble in these northern neighborhoods and threaten African Americans with their lives. If we look at another story that starts to come out when we tell this long civil rights movement story, is that we start to see that the problems African Americans face are not just the result of private choices, but the direct result of federal policies. And so if we think back to things like the Public Works Administration, established in 1933 to alleviate national housing shortage, the Public Works Administration had what they called a neighborhood composition rule. And so federal housing projects, according to this rule, needed to reflect the previous racial composition of their neighborhoods. White neighborhoods would have a white community. Black neighborhoods would have black housing projects, right? Integrated neighborhoods would have integrated housing projects. In practice, though, the Public Works Administration designated many of these integrated neighborhoods, ones that already had black and white folks living there, as either white or black, and then used public housing to make that designation come true. And so the federal government played a role in the 1930s of breaking up integrated neighborhoods and making them segregated. The first of these projects, the Techwood Homes in Atlanta, opened in 1935. It was built on land cleared by demolishing what was called the Flats, which was a low-income integrated neighborhood adjacent to downtown that included 1,600 families. Nearly a third of them were African American. And the Public Works Administration remade the neighborhood with 604 units for white families only. The Public Works Administration ended in 1937, replaced by the U.S. Housing Authority, and the manual for the U.S. Housing Authority warned that it was undesirable to have housing projects for white families in black neighborhoods and vice versa. So an example in Austin, Texas, the first of these projects by the U.S. Housing Authority. At the time in Austin, city planners had already developed a proposal to move African Americans who were scattered throughout Austin to a single East Side neighborhood. The U.S. Housing Authority then helped the city planners in Austin implement this plan by subsidizing public housing exclusively for African Americans in East Austin. Right. In your reading, we discussed a bit about the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the FHA, which were federal programs that made homeownership affordable to millions of Americans. So remember that before these programs, banks usually required buyers to put 50% of the purchase down and then make interest-only payments, and then they would have to pay off the rest of the loan after 5 to 7 years. These new federal programs allowed buyers to put 20% down and gave repayment schedules of 15 years and then later extended to 25 years. They allowed buyers to pay down the principal of the loan while paying the interest, so a buyer could actually gain equity in a home. And then, after World War II, we have the VA join these federal programs for veterans. And so by 1950, the FHA and the VA were insuring half of all mortgages, right? This is essential to the kind of growing middle class and home ownership after World War II. And so you've also read about redlining, right? And so redlining basically meant that the federal government would not insure loans for most African Americans, right? They would basically look at particular neighborhoods and make them off limits to FHA insurance, right? And so the FHA also had policies that stated explicitly that they would not insure loans unless a neighborhood was racially homogenous, right? And sometimes being racially homogenous was not enough. A black neighborhood close by was a cause for concern that might undermine a loan. And you can see here in this slide just an example of just how few loans were given to African Americans. You can see in this slide a redlining map, and so the red areas were areas that were kind of off limits for FHA loans. I'll give you just a couple of examples here where builders went out of their way to get an FHA loan, went out of their way to create segregation to get an FHA loan. And so in Detroit, a builder was denied FHA insurance for a project because a black neighborhood was close by. Right? He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the communities. Only then did the FHA insure the loan. Here's actually a picture. When evaluating loans, the FHA would look for actual barriers between black and white communities that provided a buffer. Rivers, walls, highways, train tracks often weren't enough because they were so easy to cross. Right? So again, the federal government plays a big role here in creating segregation in the United States that dates back at least to the 1930s and the New Deal and a lot of these federally funded programs. Let's transition to the Black Power movement. So Black Power is even more misunderstood than the Civil Rights Movement. And usually when I ask students, what comes to your mind when you think of Black Power, students usually say violence and guns, right? And it just speaks to how little effort high schools put into teaching the Black Power movement. And for a long time, the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power was taught like this. Right, that there was a moment in time when the Civil Rights Movement gave great hope to this country, and then Black Power came around and ruined everything. And that story still lingers in the United States. And that story, too, is a political tool to try to challenge any contemporary group that takes up any Black Power vision. And so what I want to do quickly is take a look at the key components of Black Power. One of those components is self-defense, right? Black Power advocates critiqued nonviolent civil disobedience because they didn't have the same optimism that the Civil Rights Movement did, that white people could change their racist views when they saw black folks getting beaten on the street. If whites attacked African Americans, Black Power's philosophy suggested that black folks should defend themselves. And this didn't suggest, though, that Black Power activists should go out and indiscriminately attack white people. This was about self-defense. The second principle, Black Power saw African Americans' position in the United States through a colonial framework. Right? They saw black communities as internal colonies, and thus saw African Americans as part of a global community of people of color under colonial rule. And so let's take some time to figure this out. So Black Power activists looked at black communities and saw all of the property, houses, stores, businesses, etc., owned by white folks. And then those white folks were taking all the profits from that property out of the black community and putting it into the white communities where they live. And so this looked an awful lot like the relationship in colonial states, where European countries stripped the resources out of African and Asian countries and brought those resources back to Europe. And this is why anti-colonialism was such a big part of the Black Power framework, the way that they looked at their own communities and the problems within those communities. And connected to that, so third, they advocated for black self-determination. And that was the solution to what they saw as internal colonialism, right? White folks not only owned most of the property, but generally they ran local schools and other entities. And Black Power activists wanted black folks to control their own communities. They saw this white control as paternalism, and they didn't believe that white folks truly understood the problems black communities faced. Fourth, Black Power advocated for racial pride, cultural pride. right? And this was an important challenge to centuries of teaching that African Americans had no valuable history, that whites were more beautiful, that Black culture had no value in America. It's pushing back against the post-World War II years where white racial progressives often argued for cultural assimilation. Essentially, they argued that everyone in the U.S. should view themselves as Americans and stop thinking about race. But what this really kind of turned out to be in practice is that they were advocating African Americans should shed any traces of Black culture so whites would accept them. And so Black Power pushed back against this idea of assimilation, right? Black Power argued that Black was beautiful, that Black history was important, and that Black culture had value. And if we look at all of these Black Power principles, this is probably the most significant. It's had the most long-lasting impact in the United States. And so if you didn't pick up on these principles when you read Stokely Carmichael's speech, that was one of the primary documents that you read for today, I want you to go back and read that again and see if you can identify these Black Power principles that I just laid out.